talk about vision. What are we going to do to get ourselves out of this decidedly blue situation? I don't mean politically. Congressman Anthony Weiner, who represents the 9th Congressional District, born and raised in Brooklyn and now lives in Queens, so you get to do both because there's been a little bit of a Brooklyn-Queens thing happening today. Before we can talk about vision, I just want to get this out of the way. Some people think that talking about the middle class as the middle class is a political strategy. Does the city really need a new middle class policy, or is that just a way of winning a campaign?
Well, if appealing to the middle class wins campaigns, then I did something wrong in 2005. Look, I wasn't here for the first panel that described the problem, but I think you could say without fear of contradiction that we are the financial capital of the world, although there's been some conversation about whether we're losing that edge. We are the entertainment and creative capital of the world. And up until relatively recently, you would have said that we were the middle class capital of the world. When you think of the iconic middle class family, you would think intuitively about New York. But it's not an overstatement to say that it is not a place that you go anymore if you're in the middle class, you're trying to make it into the middle class. And why that's a problem is because although Mike Bloomberg has characterized New York as a luxury product, you cannot sustain any economy, and I think this is true nationally as well, if you don't have an affordable place in the niche of the economy to provide the services for those people. You know, you can say it's great, you know, even if you own a yacht, you need someone to swab the deck and cook the meals. Even if you own a beautiful home, you still need someone to maintain it. You still need someone to patrol the streets and collect the garbage. And I have to tell you, one of the things that's most troubling to me is it's good to see that this group of elites that you circulated for this survey have internalized the idea that losing the middle class is a problem. But it's hard to point to anything, or it's very hard to point to things that the city is doing to actually address these things. You know, if you need evidence of that, just look when Mayor Bloomberg, who I think has done generally a pretty good job, but when he points to the proof points for how the city is doing well, the first thing he utters is that property values are up. Listen, that is undeniably a good thing. You want property values up, you don't want them going down. But to not understand on a fundamental level how that rise in property values is something that is making many New Yorkers deeply insecure about their fate, even if they live in one of those homes, like in my district, where their home has gone from $300,000 to $600,000. So I think that we need to do things. I still believe that we need to make the tax code more progressive. And I still think that we need to do things like I've proposed in the past to help not only big businesses like you asked about in your survey, but small businesses pool together, provide health insurance. I still think we need to realize that we have been obsessed and focused so much on the big businesses of Midtown that we've forgotten that about 60% of the job creation is going on the small businesses of the outer boroughs like Maria Thomson represents. And yet we do very little to address their concerns except give them more tickets. More regulatory barrage comes down on them every year. We do very little to help them organize, to help promote them on the internet, to help do the things that we should be doing since they're such a job-creating engine.
Perfect, and that's a great transition to Borough President Adolfo Carrión. So, Borough President Carrión, you're also an urban planner.
Yes.
So, I mean, my question is simple. Should we just give up on Manhattan when it comes to making New York City a middle-class town and just focus on the outer boroughs? Should we just write it off?
Well, first of all, I will testify that if I do see Randy Weingarten at the game, I will let everybody know that she was there. I think the fact that politicians are having this conversation, and it's the daily staple. The fact that our very own U.S. Senator has imaginary friends called the Baileys. That are this middle class.
But it wasn't a surprise that our senators had imaginary friends.
Yes, no, that's true. This is true. Politicians tend to have imaginary friends. So I think that the problem is real. The fact that 300,000 of the highest income earners in our country earn the equivalent or more of 150 million Americans at the bottom, I think is astounding and worrisome. So the problem is not unique to New York. It's unique to it's common across the spectrum, across every urban center. New York's problem is one, I believe, of having abandoned a large sector of the population that is crafty and hardworking and tends to figure things out on their own and doesn't necessarily rely on government or see it as a crutch. However, that could be the beginning of the end if we don't pay attention to that sector. I think that's the sector of strength for us. The real New York and the life of New York really plays out in the hundreds and hundreds of neighborhoods across the city where people are paying mortgages, where they're shopping for good schools, where they're concerned about the basic issues like transportation because they care about traffic circulation in their neighborhoods and the local businesses in their neighborhoods and the regulatory maze that they have to live with every day and the licensing procedures that take too long and they lose money on. That's what regular New Yorkers and that bleeding middle class, that hemorrhaging middle class is worried about. And that's why they make that critical decision of taking their shopping capacity as a sector of the marketplace and going elsewhere, which is a tremendous concern for us. So, you know, do we need to support tourism? Absolutely. We get 44 million people coming to this city, entertainment, the hotels, the theaters, all the tourist attractions. The financial sector is critical. Of course, Manhattan is critical for us, and we need to ensure that it works. That's the heartbeat of the region. But we have to pay attention to our most important asset, which is working families that ultimately are generating those little bambinos that will become good, strong, participating citizens in this free market and in this free democracy.
So I'm hearing give up on Manhattan.
No, you're not hearing that at all.
I'm kidding. All right, Maria Thomson is Executive Director of the Woodhaven Business Improvement District and founder of the Greater Woodhaven Development Corporation. And Maria, I mean, this is the reality that you deal with every day. Tell us your story of what happened in Woodhaven, but really, is the city doing all that it can to support the small businesses that everybody agrees are the backbone of the middle class?
The city of New York is more than Manhattan. It's the outer boroughs. And the outer boroughs are the last bastion of the middle class. And we live and we work in the outer boroughs. A lot of our small businesses employ local employees, give these housewives, these young people that are going to college, they give them their jobs. And they are a mainstream of monies that come into our community. And we are surviving, but the middle class is having a difficult time of it. And we're only in the outer boroughs. There is no middle class in Manhattan any longer, I don't think. We're in the outer boroughs, and we have to pay attention to us in the outer boroughs. And the city has to help us in these fines, as our congressman stated, with the paperwork, the bureaucracy, with what they put small businesses through. Small businesses are just that. They're small. They're one-person operations, or maybe they'll have 2 employees. They can't cope with the paperwork and with all that goes on that's required of them. And I think that they should really give them a break and give them some consideration and help them eliminate some of this bureaucracy from the smaller businesses. Place it in regard to how many employees they have or how much income they have. And in that basis, it'd be fair. And the playing field would be fairer for a small business owner or store owner.
Great. And I wanted to introduce our last panelist, John Liu, who's a member of the New York City Council. And I say this with absolute respect. But you're a yes.
Oh no!
But you're
get a little disrespect in there because.
But you're a council member who knows how to get press. My dad, he lives in Middletown, New York, and he said to me when I went to visit, he lived in Brooklyn, but he said to me, that John Liu, he's doing a good job. I see him on TV all the time fighting for people. So I'm going to consider you the expert on this. We asked the people in our survey of experts, is the press doing a good job of talking about middle-class issues. And a majority, almost 60% of the respondents, these are leaders in a variety of sectors, said the press does a poor job of informing the middle class about the connection between their interests and the policy and legislative debates. Do you agree? And if so, how important do you think the press is in creating the environment in which public policy can make New York City a middle-class town?
Well,
That's because you came late. So you got that one.
You get to beat up on
I think the press is very important. Let me say that from the outset. I don't, Andrea, I want to thank you for what you and your dad have said. From the outset, I will profess not to be an expert on the press and the media. What I do and what my office does is we try to keep up with people like Congressman Anthony Weiner and Adolfo Carrión, our borough president. And really, what we do is work. My office does work. I do work. And we put out information that we think is relevant. We don't decide what's news. That's what the reporters and that's what the editors do. They decide what's news. They decide what is newsworthy. We simply put out the information. To the extent that the media considers some of that information newsworthy and relevant, that I take as generally a good sign that we're on the right track. So we're always happy to do that. To answer your question about whether the press does a good job of informing people about the middle-class values of this great city of New York.
And the way the policy creates the current realities of their lives.
Well, that's a pretty complicated question, which is why we're having this kind of panel today. I think, for the most part, the news that you see on a daily basis through broadcast and print probably does not delve as much into the details or does not provide enough of an analysis, just generally speaking. Of course, there are some outstanding exceptions right here in this room. But,
That's
right.
Anybody who might potentially be writing about this event.
I think in general, there is probably not enough of the details that really explain to the general public why it is that the middle class has a very strong interest in staying in the city, why it's good for the middle class to stay in the city, but more so, what the middle class can say directly to elected officials and those in policy-making positions, the kinds of changes, if any, they would like to see. And so I'll just do very quickly some of the things that we do need to focus on, and I believe some of my colleagues in government have already addressed it, is we have to figure out a way to give people in the middle class or who strive to be in the middle class good places to live. And that means good neighborhoods, whether they be residential complexes in the form of apartment buildings or low-density residential neighborhoods. We need to provide the affordable housing, and at the same time, we need to keep the character of some of these residential areas intact, whether they be high-density Manhattan areas or low-density areas in Queens and other boroughs. Thus the rezoning efforts that we have undertaken in recent years to keep intact the residential quality of these neighborhoods. And at the same time, we have to continue the generation of jobs because the middle class needs good places to earn decent incomes. And then finally, and I think this had been addressed earlier this morning, we need to give people viable ways to get to and from their residences and the jobs. And that is good public transportation, that will discourage people from continuing to drive their cars, adding to the congestion, and therefore creating a stagnant situation for our economic growth.
I think we'll get into those areas. You want to take a
Andrea, let me, if I may, just chime in for a second. I stand at the precipice here that John stood at. He was wise enough not to go closer to the edge. But let me just suggest something. I think there's two sides to this conversation about the press. One is on the consumer side, the ability of the consumer to process the information quickly enough so that their understanding of the economy and policy and their place in the food chain, you know, I think we need a certain amount of education on that side. But then I think that there are decisions made by the news industry, especially some of, you know, the dailies, where they choose not to delve into the complications because they think they know the audience And so on the receiving side, they're making certain assumptions about people's attention span. Some of them are right, some of them are wrong, so that there are some papers. If you read the Wall Street Journal, you know that every policy decision, every time we create or reduce or modify a tax, it will have dramatic implications in people's lives. But how many people read the Wall Street Journal every day, or the Financial Times, et cetera, et cetera? So, that, you know, I think there's, I think part of the job of the press is to popularize or democratize the news about money and policy and how our economy works. And I don't know how that's done. Well, there's the other side, of course, which is bolstering up our education system and skilling people up so they could actually consume the information.
Let me take a stab at this. You know, I think part of our problem is that we in elected life don't talk to these families in a way that they care about. We're not engaging middle-class families because their life is so detached from this type of process speak. I mean, when I talked in 2005 about giving the middle class a tax cut and about asking those that make more than $1 million to pay a little bit more, I think people respond to that because it's something they could understand. It's finally someone was saying to them, we understand what you're going through. When someone sits at the table with their daughter about to send her off to their local public school, they are not thinking about, boy, I'm interested in the nuance of the reorganization of the school system that everyone's talking about right now. They want to know that their daughter is getting an experienced teacher, that's getting some face time with that teacher, that is in a safe school where discipline means something. We're not talking to them. And it's, you know, what's troubling to me is that for all of our worshiping at the altar of the middle class as a rhetorical device, I think it's important that we in government talk to those people. They've got to realize when that guy, when he's done dropping off his daughter at school, walks along 9 times out of 10 a neighborhood shopping strip where jobs are being created in remarkable numbers. You want to talk about the main difference in New York than it was 20 years ago when we were wondering what direction the city is going to go in, is a lot of those empty storefronts are now occupied by recent immigrant families who are starting businesses. When they walk around and they see those stores are doing a little better because we've done smart things, like we finally said the Department of Business Services is going to start having advocates for businesses, that we're going to start having neighborhood websites, that if you wanted to shop for shoes and you didn't want to do a mail order, you want to do it on the internet, you can go and put in your zip code and find out a neighborhood shoe store that we can help promote on NYC.com. Something when you think about the challenges of healthcare, we very often see at budget time, the mayor makes a presentation, he points to this big part of the budget and said, this is healthcare, it's outside of our control. Baloney. It's not outside of our control. It wasn't outside the control of Massachusetts, wasn't outside the control of California, wasn't outside the control of Oregon, wasn't outside the control of Hawaii. It shouldn't be outside of our control either. If we say to people, we're not just going to talk past you about these problems, but we're going to internalize and say, we understand the life that you're living. When Chuck Schumer talks to that imaginary family, that's his device for doing it, but we all should have our own devices for the way that we always realize that for the most part, when citizens are reading their newspapers or watching television, they are not seeped in the nuance of policy. They just want to have a general sense that we get it, and up to now, we in government haven't been giving them that message.
But the danger, and I hate to go back and forth so quickly, but
I would love it.
The danger is that when we use the middle class, when the politicians are at the altar of the middle class worshiping, as you suggest, and we approach this part of our audience and insult their intelligence by suggesting that a fractional lunch money income tax break is going to help them and qualitatively improve their prospects to stay or enter the middle class, I think we are at a very dangerous place. We do need to have the serious conversation with our consumer of politics and information and education, and our consumer about their future, about serious investment, which I think this is the purpose of this event, serious investment, as you suggest, Congressman, as John Liu suggests, in housing, serious investment in education, as we now have the beginnings of with the CFE victory and our new governor's commitment. Serious take by the reins the healthcare system and own up to the fact that we need to fix it. And we need strong management. And I think that's what you suggest, that we have to have a user-friendly city. But to suggest to people, which I think it's pablum, I think it's like giving somebody a bonbon and saying, here, you know, if I give you back, you know, $50 a month, your life is going to get better. It's not.
Well, let's follow up on that point about taxes. The New York Sun, you're allowed to clap. The New York Sun wrote an article in response to a new report that I think it came out about a month ago, showing that the combined state and local tax burdens in New York City is nearly 50% higher than in other major cities. Speaking of the press, the subtitle was Weiner, Wild, Spar over Findings and Latest Survey. And the Wild is Catherine Wild, who runs the Partnership for New York City, the powerful spokesperson of the city's business interests. Now, when I read it, it seemed like you were both in agreement with the need for tax cuts. You were sparring over what kind. Now, on the other side, we've got poll after poll, our experts survey, people not interested in policy by tax cut. They're interested in this kind of investment in infrastructure. Are the people ahead of politicians on this? Or do,
well, first of all,
yeah.
let me just say that I'm a firm believer that progressivity in the income tax code is something that is long overdue in this country. We have, you know, a 6% tax cut, a 6% tax surcharge on people making more than $1 million a year, and a 7% surcharge on people making more than $1 billion a year. I had one person in mind with that provision. It provides enough for everyone else to get a 10% tax cut and still have money left over to reduce the national debt. So this notion that we don't need to restore progressivity is wrong. I also want to dispute a little bit. There were some contradictory findings in your report. You'll see that the second most important thing to people that were surveyed is progressivity in the tax code, and you pointed at the reduction, at the very low number of people who thought that property tax reductions were very important. Well, I would say it's a little bit deceptive for a couple of reasons. One, only about 25% of our city owns property, the other 75% rent, and also there is this notion in the body politic that there's already been some progressivity restored by giving the $400 rebate back. Now, putting those issues aside, I think what's important here is that we understand that part of what we're doing is selling to New York City residents in the middle class that we in government get their plight. This idea that things are symbolic or that you're only going to get about $700 in a tax cut and it doesn't solve all your answers, it starts us down the path of actually saying we're going to refocus government away from this almost the cult of property values towards a different paradigm where we start to look at people with their real problems and say one by one we're going to start to address them. Let me give you a brief example about this. You know, this year, did you see the announcement of how many Westinghouse scholars we had this year? How many Intent scholarships we got this year? You didn't see it because the Board of Ed didn't even release the numbers, as they haven't for the last 3 years, because it's been a precipitous decline. Now, most middle-class families are not getting, their kids are not going to get Intel scholarships. Those are the most brilliant kids imaginable. But what those things do is they symbolically say to the middle class that the public schools are an aspirational place, that you don't just focus all of your time and attention over and over again talking about that segment that we have to save, as vital as it is. We also say to middle class families, the other 60% of the families that we're trying to make stay here in the city, we understand what you're thinking. You want to know if these new younger teachers can still get it done like the more senior teachers that have aged out like my mother. And Westinghouse scholars are on a precipitous decline. Gifted and talented, it's a fight every year to get them to fund gifted and talented. That's why these things, to dismiss them as however they were dismissed, misunderstands the mindset of a middle-class family when they're trying to decide, do we stay in New York or do we pack up our bags and leave, never to return again?
I mean, I think the notion that we need to focus on the middle class and speak to them is obviously key, but then, of course, there'll be competing people speaking to the middle class about their competing agendas, so now we need to get to what's the agenda?
I think that the middle class aspiring family, because this is really, as the Congressman suggests, about aspiration and aspirational communities and aspirational structures or structures that allow aspiration, is simply shopping for a good place to live where they can raise their children and get better prospects for the future. The players in that game are, of course, the public sector and the private sector. On the private sector side, You know, we try to create the platform for a lot of good economic activity that churns out wealth and creates jobs, and then we try to encourage the banking community to move money out into the economy. On the public side, we try to create a monetary policy that says, you know, ease the cost of money and keep it flowing. And so we manage that little thing called an interest rate and a prime rate, and et cetera, all the breakdown of that. And on the public side, we have the challenge of whether or not we're really going to invest in the building blocks that matter. And I think that's the real issue. So it is a return on investment conversation we need to be having. Instead of following the tradition of the commercial side of our society that simply teases people and teases their appetites. We're building a nation, for God's sake. This is not about, you know, getting somebody's attention for 5 minutes. This is about changing the structures that allow them to play in this economy and play in this republic. And so that means a serious land use strategy that takes into consideration the environment, transportation, housing needs, et cetera, and a serious investment in all the places that count.
Councilman Liu, is the renters tax cut a tease?
It's a tease, and it's something that I support.
I like that.
Such a tease.
The homeowners rebate that the mayor was very skillful in crafting on a public basis. That certainly worked to some extent, and the renters rebate is really a matter of fairness from my perspective, because many New Yorkers did not get anything back, even though these same renters ultimately were the property tax increase that was raised a few years ago, ultimately, by and large, that was passed on directly to the renters. And so it's a matter of equity and fairness. The long-term solution, which I think what the borough president is alluding to, is that there needs to be a tax reduction, property tax as well as income tax. If we are actually facing surpluses, then we should be rolling back the rates, just as in deficit times we found it necessary to increase rates. When we have surplus times, we do have to roll back the rates, both income and property tax, and if possible, sales tax as well. But I don't think that it's necessarily, even if we are able to reduce tax rates long-term, just minimally, I think it's still necessary. It is not, just because we're able to reduce taxes just a small amount, that's not something that should be discounted. That does send a very strong message that government is understanding that we have to be lean and mean, and that we should not be taking more from people than is absolutely necessary. At the end of the day, I think that the middle class in New York City understands that the taxes are going to be high regardless. It's always been that way in a city like New York, where we have such great diversity, where we have such great transition and turnover every single year, every single decade. But nonetheless, people in general do want to stay in New York. They want the reasons to stay in New York. And over and above the tax rebates or the renters rebates or the tax reductions, I think the most important thing that the middle class of New York City, or the aspiring middle class of New York City, would like to see is predictability. Predictability, knowing what they can expect by living in the city, knowing what they can expect from the government. And that means knowing that where they live will be stable, and that there will not be illegal conversions next door, because that is an issue. That the neighborhood character will stay the same as what they bought into, because that's exactly what they're expecting from the zoning code. That their schools will be effective and will achieve the results of educating their kids or their neighbors' kids if they don't have their own kids, and making sure that those kids even have a way to safely get to and from school. Making sure that the city or the government is not in many ways selectively and arbitrarily enforcing laws that may not even be effective. For example, when someone has to go to work for the entire day and they come back once a week or once a month finding a $100 sanitation fine because the person who was at the bus stop threw away a cup, and that cup was blown by the wind and landed in front of that person's house while that person was away at work. That is something that is an unpredictable act of government that enrages the middle-class person living in this city. It's about predictability of what it is to live in this city and what government should and should not be doing.
A couple of the things that were supported in the survey. Public full-day pre-kindergarten.
Do I support it?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Yeses down the line? I mean, it would seem simple, yet we don't have it.
Yes.
All right, since there's so much enthusiasm for the lightning round, I'll move on to another question. One of the, one of the authors of the Brookings study that was the impetus for a lot of this work documented the disappearance of middle-income neighborhoods. And he talked about the idea that not only would there be a two-tiered city, but also a two-tiered marketplace. You'd have Whole Foods for the rich and bodegas for the poor with no competition in the middle. So do you think as a city we need to be paying more attention to recruiting, to having the stores here, the Walmarts, who can keep costs down and compete for the middle-class consumer?
You know, I grew up in Park Slope. My parents, 45 years ago or so, bought a limestone duplex on 6th Street for $40,000. I grew up, my mother was a public school teacher for 32 years. My dad was a neighborhood lawyer, the head of the 6th Street Block Association, literally hung a shingle outside our house. Across the street was St. Saviour's, down the block with Bohacks. I went to the public schools my whole life. You know, you wonder if a family like mine, my dad who went to law school on a GI Bill, my mother a civil servant, a teacher for 30 years, you wonder if they would have been able to give me the same middle class opportunities that I was able to get, I'm 42, 35, 40 years ago. Where would you go? The Bohacks is no longer there. Now I think it's a D'Agostino's. St. Saviour's is one of the few parish schools that's still around, and when parish schools are disappearing, it is a sin the way government has sat on its hands and not done anything to help while these important institutions of our communities have disappeared. The public schools, you know what, probably the elementary school we'd still send our kids to, but we really would have second thoughts about the intermediate schools, the junior high schools. You need to have choices and competition among all these things, but you no longer have the local parish school to think about. You've got pretty high-end shops in Park Slope, but it doesn't matter. I'm a congressman, I make a pretty good salary. I can't afford to live in the neighborhood that I grew up in. And I ask you to think about this as you visualize this issue. You get a call from a friend or who says, listen, I just got a great job, $75,000 working at Bear Stearns or at a local law firm. Tell me a nice affordable place I can go to set up shop in New York City to raise my middle class family. Think about that in your mind during this conversation. Think about where you tell them to go. It wouldn't be anywhere in Manhattan. It'd be fewer and fewer places in the outer boroughs. And then think about this. Think about finding yourself saying, no, Jersey City, Hoboken, easy now, easy now. So I think that you do need to have this different types of opportunities available. And if you think Walmart is somehow the holy grail of additional opportunities, I can tell you the reason I led the fight to stop Walmart on Queens Boulevard is I thought about Jamaica. I thought about the small shops down Queens Boulevard, the Austin Street, that would have disappeared within weeks, and I would have thought, would I live in a better community in that case or a worse? And I decided worse is the answer.
I don't think that the premise of Walmart providing low prices, lower than other places can offer in the city of New York for the long term, is a given. I think there's a great deal of debate about whether a store like Walmart actually does decrease prices in the long term. In the near term, they generally do, and many times, and it's been documented in other major metropolitan areas, that they do so to basically disrupt and in some cases destroy the existing businesses, and then in the long term, they slowly ratchet up their prices so that in the long term, the consumers aren't really getting the so-called low prices that they thought they were going to get. So to say that should we get low prices for neighborhoods for the middle class in New York by allowing stores like Walmart to come in, I think the premise of that is shaky. But the issue of whether the middle-class consumers in this city have enough choice. I do think that for the most part they do. I think the poor neighborhoods, the low-income neighborhoods, they do not have an adequate range of choices. But for the most part, the middle class in this city do. And if you look at the consumer prices over the last, say even 20 years, the prices, the consumer prices, when you go to the supermarket, many of the staples have not increased a substantial amount. It's certainly rent and housing have skyrocketed. Other kinds of costs of living have skyrocketed. But going to the supermarket, 20 years ago, you could get a dozen eggs for somewhere between $1 and $2, depending on the store that you went to. The same is true today. A quart of milk has gone up substantially, but that's regulated. But if you look at the price of orange juice, the price of orange juice has actually dropped over the last 20 years, compared to today's prices compared to the prices from 20 years ago. If you're shopping for clothing, unless you're shopping all the time on Madison and Fifth Avenue, the price of clothing has also not increased. In fact, in many cases, because of now the global nature of the trade, it has dropped on average. So, but these choices are only available to the middle class. The middle class who is mobile, who can go either to the neighborhood store or travel to a store that's 1, 2, or in some cases 10 miles away. So I would think that it is not necessary to start saying that we need to allow new kinds of stores, such as these superbox stores, to come into New York in order to give the middle class or even the lower income class more of a choice.
The Brookings Institute went so far as to call it a tax on the poor, that they did not have Walmarts available to them, so they were paying more than they had to for basic
Well,
goods.
you know, price competition is a reality of our economy. The players in that marketplace will find ways of getting around policy, law, and whatever obstacles we put in the way, wages, benefits, et cetera, to try to get the highest bang for their investment. I don't think Walmart or any other big player is going away. What we have done is we have fought, I think, artfully in this town through different instruments we have, like the City Council. Our congressional representatives have stepped forward and said, you're not going to just come in here and pay people poverty wages, et cetera, and we'll continue to do that. I think the City Council has recently in the Bronx, for instance, when we did the community benefits agreement for a new 1 million square foot mall at 149th Street and the Harlem River, where for the first time, you know, the big bucks came into the conversation, in this case in the form of BJ's, and there was a deal crafted with them that would allow people on public assistance and poor families to, for instance, not have to pay certain membership or et cetera, and a wage structure that was fair for our marketplace. So I think that this is a much more complicated conversation, but to think that price competition is, that we're going to keep it out, I mean, you know, somebody else will come up with something else. We need to protect the workers. We need to have good, strong land use policy. In that land use discussion, we need to make sure that we incorporate the other issues that are real in people's lives, that it's not just simply a land use discussion, but it's that land use has implications for how the market behaves. So, you know, I think Walmart it's the flavor of the moment, but it'll emerge as something else because those forces in our marketplace are real.
Okay, let me just say one thing. You know, it's true, the Brookings study was correct in this point that it's a tax on the poor. It's a tax on the middle class. It's a tax on all of us. When they don't provide health insurance, overwhelming numbers of their employees go to public assistance to get health care. So this notion
Absolutely.
that you are paying a tax, we all are. When they fail to pay to provide health insurance, it's a tax, an indirect tax on all of us. And let me just say one other thing. Yes, there's always going to be price competition. I don't know what, I don't know what exactly that means, but I can tell you this, that it's always going to have to be all of us in government and all of us in labor and people, citizens, deciding that there's a certain expectation we're going to have about worker conditions, an expectation we're going to have about what type of entities we want in our city. It would be a Pyrrhic victory if we say, yes, we've got a 15% discount on socks if you open Walmart, but you wind up losing the employment and the economic foundation of our neighborhood shopping strips, which are the lifeblood of the middle class, because you make that bargain. It's a Faustian bargain we should not make. Walmart is not banned forever. Just because they lost round one against me doesn't mean that they are going, they're going to go away forever. If they step up and say, you know what, we want to be good corporate citizens, we want to provide the health care we need, we're prepared, we're not going to be omnivorous competitors against our neighborhood small shops, then I think all of us should take the posture. If you're willing to straighten up and fly straight, we're prepared to welcome you back with open arms.
And let's actually talk about this healthcare issue, because there actually was support in our survey across the board, including the private sector, for requiring large businesses to provide health insurance. But then, of course, Sarah Horowitz on our first panel was talking about the increasing irrelevance of tying health insurance and health coverage to employment. So, I mean, let's say that you were given the opportunity to become mayor of the city of New York, and I'll ask everyone so as not to spotlight the two people who are rumored to be interested in that office.
John's the only one that has the money to do it.
and the press connections that's the issue. So, I mean, with these tensions between employment-based as something you can approach, but yet it's increasingly irrelevant. As mayor, what would you do to address this challenge, which, again, by our survey was rated the top challenge for middle-class families, is being able to have health insurance?
Where do you want to start?
I'll start with Councilman Liu.
Okay, well, that's a pretty outlandish scenario that you put that in the context of. But
we won't start any rumors here.
Right, right. No need to start rumors. The idea of health insurance for the middle class or for the aspiring middle class is obviously critical. Let me address it from, I think, a perspective that could be different from what some of the other respondents might address it from, and that is from the communities, the rising communities of new Americans who are part of this great city. There are many new Americans, immigrants in New York City who are either have attained or are close to attaining the middle class and yet have no insurance. And in many cases, they don't have the access to insurance because many of them are in the middle class because they're entrepreneurs, they run their own businesses, or they work for very small businesses, mom and pop businesses, or businesses that employ less than 50 people. And so health insurance is generally not available through the workplace for these individuals. And so they have to go out in the marketplace and pay exorbitant premiums for individual or small group coverage. That's something that we need. It's probably, I would say it is mostly beyond the scope of what a municipality can do. That's something that requires a state and ultimately federal policy, which I think that our presidential contenders will certainly be addressing between now and next year. So it is a real issue for the new Americans growing up, so to speak, in New York City. I'm not exactly sure what we could do in New York City. I think we're looking at Medicaid reform, both from the perspective of reducing the cost to the city, and at the same time, by reducing some of that waste that the city experiences, expanding some of that coverage to more New Yorkers. But the Medicaid issue, I don't see directly relevant to the middle class itself. The middle class, what we need to do is to bring about overall change in the healthcare delivery system so that those individual premiums or the small group premiums can be reduced in the long term. And I think the way to do that is really at the state and national level. If I can think of a way to do it at the municipal level, I'm going to put out a report just like Congressman Weiner has right here.
Congressman Weiner, you're mayor. What can we do about this health insurance?
Well, I'm reluctant to answer too fully because I'm giving a speech on this in the spring, and I want Caldwell to cover it like it's news. So, but look, there's a couple of things that we can do immediately. By the way, the premise of the previous panel is exactly right, that this ultimately, at the end of the day, is a federal thing that we need to do to make health care fully transportable, not employer-based. But there are some things that we should be doing in the city immediately to make it easier for us to deliver health care. First of all, we have the ability to do what no small business individually can do, and even no business improvement district can do, which is to help form pools of small businesses to help them negotiate for lower insurance rates. We have the ability to go out and say, you know what, if you guys want, you tell us how many employees you have, and if we can put together a pool of 300,000 or 400,000 employees, or of 50 or 60,000 employees, and allows the city of New York to essentially be the agent to organize them, you can then be able to negotiate for lower health care costs. Another thing we need to do is realize that currently the way we have our hospitals, the hospital relationships with insurance companies is terribly imbalanced right now. The insurance companies hold all the cards. And there are some simple things that we should be advocating for to make it easier for hospitals to survive in New York. For example, if you are a hospital and you want to convert your beds that are used now for inpatient and to create a community-based outpatient facility, the regulatory obstacles in your way are humongous because we are still locked into this very 1970s model about how we're going to provide health care. We also need to do something else. We need to say that just because Medicaid is technically something that is outside of our control, we are one of the few cities, I think outside of North Carolina, we're the only state that has a city match that pays for a portion of Medicaid. But we have farmed out and allowed the state to do all of our efforts to cut down on waste and fraud. We should say our 25%, we have a great deal at stake there. We're going to go out and try to cut down on this waste on ourselves. We're not just going to refer everything up to Albany. The rest, you're going to have to wait till you read Diane's story in a couple of months.
Borough President?
Ditto.
On the proposals or the story?
No, I agree with the congressman on these initiatives. I think a small business and self-employed health co-op purchasing plan, if you will, it's powerful. On the insurance company side, it's attractive, obviously. I think the mayor of this town has to always, of course, negotiate good labor contract deals that make sense for the workers and this middle class that we're trying to grow. I think we can still expand programs like the Child Health Plus and the other instruments we've created. And one of the really sad stories in our state and in our city is so many people that are eligible to enroll in these programs don't enroll. And so we need to step up our, a very aggressive enrollment and education campaign to get these folks enrolled in these free healthcare instruments. And then, of course, I think Elliot is right to a certain extent, Elliot Spitzer, in the sense that structurally the system is still broken. The healthcare system here to a great extent, and that's not to take sides in the most recent argument, but to say that
we heard you took sides.
Yeah, there are some broken pieces that need real attention, and then of course the responsibility of the federal government. But I anxiously await. What's the date, Congressman?
For what's that?
For your unveiling.
My unveiling? That has a different that has a different meaning in my religion.
Of the healthcare plan that you're going to present. I anxiously await
that wasn't in our survey, so we can't speak to that. Health insurance for small businesses?
I defer to my congressman.
But I'd like to just emphasize a point that I was trying to make earlier, that we want, from a city perspective, people, middle-class people, all people, but especially the middle class, want predictability from government. And that also means that knowing what to expect from the different levels of government, city government, state government, and federal government. The healthcare issue and reducing healthcare costs, there are some things that the city may be able to do on the fringes, but it has to come from the state and the federal governments. The Child Health Plus, Family Health Plus, those are state programs that are run at the state level. Even Medicaid itself is administered at the state level. To the extent that we can form groups or cooperatives or purchasing collectives to maximize bargaining power, that would work only when marketing is a huge component of the cost of healthcare. Marketing is a big component, but the biggest component of healthcare costs is not the marketing. It's not even the healthcare delivery itself in terms of the actual cost of the medicine, the doctor's time, the room in the hospital. It is the administrative costs that are seemingly insurmountable. And I don't know if you can get around these huge administrative costs by trying to develop collectives even within a city level.
All right, let me just say this. It is, if you think for a moment, a city on earth that would be more capable of having a city-based healthcare plan. Think about one has a large number of teaching hospitals, a large number of people who are doing very well, enormous amounts of Medicaid payments going out, enormous amounts of Medicare payments going out because we have a fairly aged population. The money that we have in the healthcare system here in New York and the assets that we have to provide healthcare are second to none in the world. If you think I'm wrong, stand at the International Arrivals Building at JFK and watching the richest people from all around the world come to get healthcare here in New York. We have the ability to do it. Ideally, of course, we are going to have to wait for President Clinton to get this done in 2009. But I think that we should always be leaning forward, Councilman, into the notion that we have to wait for someone else to do it. We are New York City. We should not be reading in the newspaper how a Republican governor of Massachusetts and of California figured out a way to bring the assets to bear. We should be doing it all the time. Now, this is a fundamentally national problem, no doubt about it. We want people to be able to travel to Connecticut and keep their health insurance, but this notion that we should sit and wait, and I just want to correct one thing. It is not a function of marketing that getting everyone on Flushing, on Main Street, to join up solves. It is the economies of the scale. When individual shopkeepers are having to negotiate with GHI or with Aetna, they are completely at the whim of the insurance companies. If we, as the city of New York, say, go on to 311 or go on to the website, you click and we'll bring you down a form, you'll fill out how many employees you have, you'll join this pool, and then we, the city, say, you know what, now we have 100,000 people. And you watch, these insurance companies will bid for a business of someone $100,000 and will say, you can't discriminate, you're going to have to cover certain things, you're going to have to make sure. We should be in the business of trying to pool our resources here, not waiting on the sidelines and hoping that the insurance companies in their benevolence do it themselves.
Congressman, I just would be more comfortable with agreeing to those statements if I really felt that the administrative costs of setting up another layer, even at the city level, of accounting for and processing the paperwork and subsequently negotiating with insurance companies, that administrative cost would not be substantial in and of itself, perhaps almost to the point of exceeding the synergistic cost savings that I think you're referring to. I think the fundamental problem there is that this is not a system we have where the consumer negotiates with the provider and they settle upon a cost. The problem is that we have a pure third-party paying system where the costs, the reimbursements that the hospitals and the doctors are paid, they're set at the national level for the most part, some at the state level. We have no control as a municipality over setting those reimbursement rates. People are not paying the medical bills out of their own checkbooks. They're being paid for, in most parts, through insurance companies that are setting the rates, the predetermined rates, and that's how most people get their health care. So if they were able to, if I was going to go to a doctor and say, you know what, look, I need a shot for the flu, how much are you going to charge me, and compare that to another provider, that's one thing. But the fact is, I'm getting my insurance, I have no control over what that reimbursement is. I don't know if we're going to have that control at the city level. That's made by the big insurance companies at the national level, or perhaps the regional level, and at the federal level under Medicaid and Medicare. Those are predetermined reimbursement
John,
rates.
I think you're misunderstanding what I'm suggesting. I'm suggesting pooling resources so the premiums that we're paying. Listen, I'm interested in what the doctors are getting reimbursed by the insurance companies. My problem that I'm trying to solve is the high cost of health insurance and over 46 million people in this country who have no health insurance. The toughest place to go to get health insurance, I'm not talking about the reimbursement rate, I'm not talking about Medicaid, I'm not talking about Medicare, I'm talking about being able to afford to provide health care. I bet you if you asked shopkeepers, if you could afford at a reasonable rate, would you provide health care to your employees? And someone with 2 or 3 or 4 employees can't get a reasonable rate. Someone who has a negotiating power of 40,000 can negotiate down the rate. That's what you're trying to do.
If the intention of this was to get the creative juices flowing and to focus on our attention on the incredible challenge of healthcare, you've accomplished it. This deserves creative attention. We obviously, we need restructuring. In order to do that, it is going to be a very serious and complicated process. However, I think it deserves attention. It deserves examination. When you're talking about a city of this size with the capacity that we have and the money that's spent on healthcare and moves through this economy, the healthcare economy, with all our structures, with all the players, the teaching hospitals, the public hospital system, the voluntary hospitals, et cetera, the private doctors, the employers, I think, obviously, somebody can probably put together a nice plan for New York on
Yes, somebody can.
Thank you, the panelists. And, yeah, thank you.